Without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Jen Cleland, who is no stranger to ASME, as a former chair of ASME and the RME Research Committee, and I think she's someone who's really seen firsthand the expansion of medical education research through her editorial roles, and from coming as the inaugural chair of medical education research at Aberdeen through to the move to Singapore, and also in the book that she's been editing. You can see that expansion of medical education research with the updated and new chapters that we've been advertising on the rolling slides today. So I'd really like to hand over to Jen, and I'm really looking forward to her sharing her reflections on expansion over her time in medical education. So over to you.
Thanks. This makes me sound like really old. I've been around forever, which is probably, there's some truth to that. So, as Alison said, I've had a long association with ASME, and I was just talking to Sandra Nicholson, trying to remember the first time I came to this conference, the Researching Medical Education Conference. And we can't actually remember precisely, that's how long ago it was. But I think it was about 2007. And then I went on to organise it as the chair of the ASME Research Committee and then oversee it as the chair of ASME. But this is one of my favourite conferences because it's a nice size and it's jolly. And it's focused on research, which is, my passion. So it's just so nice to have people in the room that are all about research. Because if you go to the big conferences, and we all do, there's a lot of evaluation, there's a lot of people saying, oh, this is what we do. But this one is very much focused on proper research. And hopefully that'll be reflected a little bit in my talk. So today I'm going to talk about what's true, what's evidence, and who has authority. Please don't assume I'm going to give you all the answers to all of this, but hopefully there'll be something to reflect on and something new. So a little bit of an overview is always useful. Let me just check things, right? Sometimes I've been waxing lyrical for about 15 minutes and someone's gone, your slides aren't showing. So it's always good to check. So I'll talk a little bit about the evolution of medical education, how research in the field has developed, how knowledge advances, who has authority, and a bit of reflection. So not necessarily in that order. I do tend to kind of go off on tangents, but hopefully there will be a coherent whole. When I was preparing this talk, I thought, well, hang on a minute. I think we all have a rough idea of when medicine started, or rather when medicine was first recorded. And this is one of the first incidences, or the first records. A lot of the records came from Greece, but there's debate about where medicine did actually start. There's a feeling that it started in Egypt, but in terms of record keeping, the Greeks have that space. And this is a Greek physician treating a woman in about the 5th century BC. So quite some time ago. But how did one learn to become a doctor? When did medical education actually start? Well, that's quite interesting because it took a bit longer. So initially learning to be a doctor was purely by the apprenticeship model. And we do talk about the apprenticeship model now, particularly in things like surgical education. But this was truly the apprenticeship model, just as you would learn to be a butcher or a cobbler or a farmer or anyone. It was the same. You were assigned to work with somebody who's more experienced. Often your family would pay for you to go and learn with somebody who's more experienced. And you would shadow and you would observe until you were considered competent to work independently. So in some ways, things don't really change, but I don't think they had a CCT then, or, exit exams or an MLA, but there was some assessment of competence and then you could work independently. But there was no classroom or book learning, and actually most doctors tended to be illiterate in these days. So that went on for centuries. And then the first recorded medical school was in the 9th century in Italy. Now, there is, again, some debate about this. When you say to people, where was the first medical school? A lot of people will say Bologna. But actually, it was in Salina. And amazingly, for those days, it accepted men and women. And probably, also amazingly, it focused on prevention, not cure. So we've kind of gone backwards since that time in terms of what our hospitals focus on or what our education focuses on. But there was lots of medical schools set up about the 15th century, the Renaissance, particularly throughout Europe, and many of those medical schools are still going strong, Vienna, Leipzig, and so on. So we've got medical schools from the 9th century, but admittedly most of them coming around in the Renaissance. But, excuse me, when did we start talking about medical education, really? And when did we start looking at medical education research, although I use the term research loosely in the early days? And the first medical journals, the first clinical medicine journals, were about the 17th century, 18th century. But the first medical education journals weren't until the 20th century. So academic medicine in the first edition was in 1926. And then, excuse me, and then medical education was in 1956. So we took a little bit of time to catch up, but generally speaking, our journals, our reporting, our discussion of medical education was a lot later than our reporting and our discussion of medicine. So one of the interesting things was you can still get that first edition of academic medicine online. So I went to have a look at it, and I've cut and pasted some clips for you to read because I thought it was quite entertaining. So of course, sorry, it's all a bit blurry. The font's not great because it's literally a photocopy of something that was typeset nearly 100 years ago, but hopefully it's legible. That's not too bad. So this was admissions, and admissions is something that's very close to my heart. I thought, gosh, when I read this, I thought, crumbs, things haven't actually changed that much, have they? So you have to pass an exam to get into medical school. Gosh, yes, we've really moved on from that. Curriculum development, this one amused me. I'll just read it out. The statement has often been made that it would be well, even desirable, that certain medical schools that are well prepared to do so be permitted and encouraged to depart from all prescriptions and standards for the purpose of undertaking educational experiments with the objective of improving conditions now existent. So if you were a medical school, you could kind of try out, you could do things differently. If you were well prepared and if you were a certain medical school. How what you were meant to do, how you could change things wasn't clear. There's nothing really much more than this statement. But this is curriculum development, old style, or maybe new style. And then research, I won't read this one out, but it's that kind of that tension that still goes on. I very much see it in my current medical school. How much research training should medical students have? We have to train people to be able to use research, to critically appraise the literature, to use research to inform their clinical practice. But are we also training doctors or medical students so that they become scientist practitioners? Where's the balance? I don't think we've got it. So that was then, and things have changed. The first photo, the old-fashioned photo, is actually a lecture theatre in Edinburgh University. I don't know if there's anybody from Edinburgh here. Yeah? Have you been in this lecture theatre?
Every morning for years.
Years ago, I had to give a lecture in it, and it's a tiny room. Probably the square footage is a lot less than this room, and it's so steep. As the lecturer, you're kind of like this, talking to people in the top tier. And if you're on the top tier, it's vertiginous. It's absolutely horrible. But it was used then, and clearly it is still used now. So our learning spaces have not improved. But that was the medical students of then, and the medical students of today are a bit different, and the facilities that we use are a little bit different. And we have now had the benefit of a number of years, a number of decades of medical education research, academic medicine in 2026. But it would be fair to say that if you look at those early journals, really up till about the 90s, the research wasn't really research. It was more we do this and we do that. And actually, if I wanted to be really non-PC, I would say academic medicine still publishes a lot of that type of paper. But we have moved on. And I was going to pull on two papers. So there's an old paper by Dave Cook, George Burdage and Henk Schmidt from 2008, and a newer paper from Maastricht from Diana Dolmans and Jeroen van Meribom. And they've kind of tried to split research into phases or waves. So the first wave of research, the sort of early research, was about, does something work? And the second wave was more about outcomes and justification. And the third wave of research is more about clarification or trying to recognise complexity. I'm going to work through a couple of examples to demonstrate how this actually can be seen in practice. So I've got two examples. I'm going to use the example of problem-based learning, which is not my area, but just thought it might be interesting because there are a number of medical schools with PBL curriculum. And the second running example will be Widening participation to medicine. So in problem-based learning, a lot of research in problem-based learning, particularly in the 80s and the 90s, it was the new thing. Excuse me, not just in medicine, but in other disciplines too. And the early studies used to look at things like, is PBL effective in enhancing students' knowledge, skills, and motivation? And as I say, a lot of studies, so that allowed for meta-analyses. But the results of these meta-analyses, putting all the studies together, were quite conflicting. So some of the meta-analyses said, yes, PBL is effective in enhancing X, Y, and Z. Other meta-analyses said, well, no, all the studies that we've analysed indicate that it's not. And other meta-analyses said, well, it seems to work for some things, but not for others. So, these studies are not perfect. A lot of what we do is not perfect because this is not a randomised controlled trial of, student A gets PBL and student B gets TBL and student C gets lectures, and how do you blind people to the kind of education that they're getting. So a lot of it was comparing, say, one cohort there would be a cohort that got lectures, then there was a curriculum change, and then the next cohort got PBL. Was there any difference in these cohorts in terms of their performance in a final year exam or a satisfaction with the course? So, not perfect research, but kind of pragmatic research, but very much focused on, do students like it? Do they do just as well in exams? You think, well, okay, we kind of needed to know that, and probably we needed to know that type of information to justify changing curricula. So what about the second wave? The second wave of PBL was a bit more focused on what was actually going on, not just the outcomes. Excuse me, so there were some hints from those early meta-analyses that there was PBL was something to do with the application of knowledge. That was the thing that seemed to be different and critical. So the second wave of research looked at discrete components of PBL. My current university does TBL, team-based learning. I'm talking about PBL, so forgive me if I kind of slip up. But this wave of research looked at things like assessment methods, thanks Alison, the different types of cognitive processing, trying to get a bit more specific, a bit more detailed on how different things might influence learning outcomes. And that research was better. It was kind of moving things on a little bit and helped move it on to clarification studies. So the kind of thing that you would see recently, although PBL research if you open the journals now, there's a lot less research onto PBL as there would have been 10 years ago and certainly 20 years ago. But we're now looking at PBL in different places and cultures. And this one's fascinating because in 2009, I went to Japan as a visiting professor for a few months, and my medical school taught PBL. And I thought, this is nothing like PBL I've ever seen before. It was completely different from the kind of PBL I would be seeing in the UK, particularly Glasgow, which was I was in Aberdeen, but Glasgow was the nearest that did PBL. And I thought, oh, this is all about the culture. Things are different. The kind of students are different. The education system that they come through before they get to medical school is different. And how PBL was enacted in the classroom or in the discussion room was so different in Japan from what I saw in Glasgow. And that's now, that started to come out in studies. And Jannica Frambach in Maastricht has done a number of nice papers looking at this, just saying, a lot of what we do is influenced by culture and by context. There's also clarification studies comparing outcomes and processes across disciplines. So PBL is not a medical thing, it's used in lots of different disciplines. Do we see PBL differently? Are the outcomes different? Are the processes different depending on what discipline? And of course, particularly given the last few years, but before that, there was a lot of interest in how can PBL be delivered online? Can it be delivered digitally? Can you get that small group work going online? And there's been so much research published because of COVID, and most of it's, to be blunt, crap. So many papers that are like, we did this during COVID and our students liked it. Right, okay, that's going to change the world. Or I think there's only about one study that actually looked at outcomes and said that, okay, students who have learned online during COVID did the same in the final year exam or did similarly to the previous cohort. But a lot of it, a lot of the research is shockingly bad. And hopefully some better research will come out from COVID in due course. It is starting, but the papers that were rushed out are all very poor quality. So that's a kind of how PBL has evolved over the years. And, where are we going to go now with PBL? I think we want to look at the individual components of PBL and of things like TBL. What are the mechanisms? What's actually going on with PBL? How does it work? How do the different components interact? There's so many questions that are much more about sort of teasing out the complexity of PBL and doing so in a way that aids conceptual generalizability. So plenty more to do. So for my second example, I'm going to look at widening participation and widening access to medicine. And I obviously have to plug the new book. And you will all have received an email at some point today from Jenny Ogg saying you can pre-order the book and I think you get a discount. How can you resist? But I'll give you a wee bit of the history before we go into the examples. So the first edition of Researching Medical Education was commissioned when I was the chair of ASME, and it had been in gestation for many years. And it started with an idea of doing a book on workplace learning, and I thought, well, I don't really know very much about workplace-based learning. And the kind of an idea about doing something that was very British, and I thought, well, does anybody really care? So Steve Durning was the chair of the RME Research Committee at the time. I was also in RME Research Committee, and I thought, between Steve and I, we know everybody. We had really good address books. So it was like, why don't I get Steve on as co-editor and we can make it a truly international book, and we had an international advisory panel and so on. And the first edition was published in 2015, and it sold very well, which allowed us to then be commissioned to do a second edition. And as I was saying to somebody earlier, the nice thing about a second edition on the back of a successful first edition is the publisher gives you more pages. So instead of 24 chapters, this one's got 30 chapters, and I was able to, or Steve and I were able to think, we dropped a couple of things for the original one, and then we were able to invite lots of more colleagues to contribute to this one, including Celine. So I would say it's nice. It's a good book. It's useful. So, but there's one chapter in it that Sandra Nicholson and I wrote with some of our former PhD students looking at widening access to medicine, and we used the same format, this kind of waves of research, clarification, description, and so on. So I'll talk through some of these as well. So when the first studies of widening access to medicine were published, they were really descriptive. It was things like, at our medical school, we did a scheme to widen access to medicine. We brought 15 people from non-traditional backgrounds into our university, and most of them passed first year, and most of them passed second year, some of them dropped out, and this number actually got a medical degree. That was what you were reading. It wasn't a study. It was reporting some basic routine data. There wasn't really anything in terms of evaluation, or rather that was the evaluation. We got people in, and we spat them out the other end, or we spat most of them out the other end. And then when it was coming to, what kind of experiences were non-traditional students having? Well, there really wasn't very much on that either, other than satisfaction surveys, particularly of things like in summer schools or outreach events. So students attended our outreach event, they liked it, and they say that they're more likely to apply for medicine because they attended it. Okay, but did they actually apply to do medicine? Well, we don't know because you didn't actually follow them up, you didn't measure them. And there was a few better studies trying to understand the barriers to applying for medicine for people from groups that didn't traditionally apply to medicine, but it was pretty rubbish. So things did then progress. We heard earlier about UK Med. So there was precursors to UK Med, the UK CAT database, for example, that a number of people in this room have worked with. And we started seeing some really decent longitudinal multi-site quantitative studies run by Chris McManus, Paul Tiffin, John Dowell, and so on and so forth. Interesting studies that started to unpick what was going on. But there was also, trying to unpick the socio-demographics and the progression and predictive validity and all these things. And there was also some more credible qualitative studies. So the area was improving, the quality of research was improving, and we were starting to learn more. We still didn't have the answers, but we were starting to learn more. And this isn't one of my studies that was a kind of example, I think, of one of the better qualitative studies. That sounds really arrogant, doesn't it? So this is my study. I think it's quite good. But it's about, this was work that we did for the GMC, but it took us a few years to publish it. And I was just very aware at the time that there was these government directives to widen participation to medicine. But knowing the area, I could see that medical schools were doing it completely differently. So the policy was the same, but how it was enacted was different. So we interviewed admissions deans and staff from 24 UK medical schools, had tons of data, and then used a particular theoretical lens to look at it, a lens called policy enactment. And the whole policy enactment theory is about a policy tells you what to do, but it doesn't tell you how to do it. So we were able to unpick the how different institutions, how different medical schools were enacting widening participation. And we found there was lots of differences, and those depended on kind of the culture of the medical school and the university, the priorities of the university, the position of the individual admissions dean on widening participation. Was it something they were supportive of or not? And also some practicalities such as resources, because change in admissions processes, just as any change, is perceived as costly in terms of resources. And there were some interesting findings in terms of medicine, the goals of medicine and the goals of policies and widening participations were quite in tension at the time. So, but I think that was a useful paper, because one of the other things about it is we didn't look at it from the point of view of the students. We looked at it from the point of view of the kind of the structures and the systems. And if you're going to do change, you really need to start looking at those levels, not just individual levels. So things have progressed, and we've got the clarification studies, much more theory being used in studies of widening access, widening participation. And as I said earlier, we're still talking to the individuals, we're still looking at what's going on at the individual student level and teacher level, but we're also looking at systemic issues. And Salim's done a lot of work in this area as well. And that's quite interesting, because different countries, different contexts are different because of their history, because of all sorts of social things. But I think now we're looking at not do widening access programs work, but how do they work? So I'm going to do a sort of worked example of something that happened in Aberdeen. So we were given Scottish Government funding to set up G2M, Gateway to Medicine programme in 2017. And it was like a lot of government funding. We went down to the Scottish Government, we put in our bid, we were awarded the money, or the contract, whatever you want to call it, and they were like, okay, so now you have to have students on your Gateway programme in about 3 months' time. Yikes. So there was a lot of innovation to try and get people to advertise the course to try and get students in. But one of the interesting things about it was a partnership with the local college. So the Gateway to Medicine students come to Aberdeen, they're given university accommodation, they spend first term at the local college, mostly focusing on kind of further developing their skills in chemistry, biology, and so on and so forth, learning about the medical admissions process. And then after Christmas, they move on to the medical school campus and learn much more about kind of medicine, professional identity development, and so on. But it's quite a holistic preparatory year, and they have ongoing tutor support throughout all of this. So we thought, okay, after 2 or 3 years of this, we thought, well, let's actually try and figure out what's going on. And after much debate, we thought, let's do a realist evaluation. How does G2M work? Now, I haven't got my glasses on, so I can't actually read what's in these little boxes. Just bear with me a moment. So those of you that know about realist evaluation, it's this idea of what works for whom under what conditions. And you have, so for us, we wanted to describe the programme. What did we think? Why did we think it would work? We had put a lot of thought into it, but why did we think that particular format and organisation structure would work? And moving over to how would we kind of hypothesize that it would work? What would our initial theory be? You have to have a kind of working theory when it comes to realist evaluation, and then you test that working theory by collecting data. And typically then, once you've done the data collection, you kind of change your programme theory, your working theory, to have a concluding theory, your final theory. And you refine the theory through the process. It's really nice, it's quite iterative, it's quite complicated, but for something that is inherently complicated, or complex, sorry, it's a good approach. So our initial working programme theory was that the success of the Gateway to Medicine programme would be dependent on students being adequately supported through in lots of different ways, academically, professionally, financially, and personally. And those support systems needed to be in place for the students to transition across from school to the Gateway programme to medical school. So this was our initial programme theory. The context mechanisms, outcomes, and that's again a terminology you hear a lot with realist evaluation. So in terms of context, they had to take a curriculum that was relevant to medicine. It seems quite obvious, but it's good to spell these things out. We wanted them to undertake relevant healthcare work, and so we were working in partnership with the local trust, and they gave the Gateway to Medicine students bank jobs, and we would support the students throughout the programme. So what were the mechanisms of success? The students had to develop confidence in their abilities. They had to develop a professional identity as a medical student. They had to be financially secure, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you don't have those baseline things, then it's not going to work. And what were the outcomes that we wanted? That the students would successfully transition through these different educational environments. They would see medicine as achievable, and so, well, that's it. That's what it was. So we looked at lots of different data sources. We looked at documents. We had focus groups with staff and key stakeholders. We also had focus groups with students over several cohorts of Gateway to Medicine students. This wasn't just a sort of one-off. And we used all this information to refine the materials. So this is I'm not going to go through all these little boxes because I know they're not particularly clear, but I wanted to put up the visual to show you that it's pretty complex. How a Gateway to Medicine programme works is not straightforward. It's not if we have A plus B equals C. There's a lot going on, and there's different relationships between different components. And while our initial programme theory, I'll just go back, was, looks quite straightforward, by the time we'd finished analysing the data, it looked a lot more complex. There was a lot more going on. And yes, our initial programme theory was reasonably good. It was good. It was a good basis, but there was a lot more as well. So things like the students wanted to feel challenged by the curriculum. They wanted basic things like the idea that they became familiar with the medical school environment as well as the university environment. That was really important. That was actually extremely helpful to them. And I know some of this might seem quite obvious, but it's not obvious until you start teasing it out. We helped them establish a sense of belonging. We helped them establish supportive relationships with staff. And the outcomes were, as we had hoped, the transition through the educational environments, this preparedness to transition into medical school, and so on and so forth. And the programme's been very successful in terms of bums on seats, in terms of people coming into Gateway to Medicine and staying in and going through medicine. So if we go back to the very first round of research in this area, the numbers that we took in and how many were lost and how many stayed. Yes, we can still report all of that for Gateway to Medicine, but we can report much, much more than that. We can understand what's going on. So it provided the experiences that helped students develop the qualities that they needed to achieve their goal of studying medicine. Okay. And we will carry on and look at that. But one of the points I want to make is this is what the Aberdeen Gateway to Medicine programme looks like. This is what seems to work for it. And it has a particular format, a particular population of students. I think if we look at Gateway to Medicine programmes in other universities, they're not going to look identical to this. We have to look at each of them individually. Things are complex and contextual. So what's going to go now? What do we have to look at? I mean, if we were sticking to widening access, COVID has certainly brought systemic inequalities to the fore. There's probably something there that we need to look at. We still need to look more at institutional and structural issues. Really want to look at where people from different types of backgrounds go on in terms of career choice and where they work. And UK Med is useful for that, and we've done plenty of work looking at those questions already, but there needs to be more work. And again, I always come back to this point that studies have to be conceptually clear and theoretically grounded, because only by doing so are they generalisable to different contexts. Because really, why should anybody care about the Gateway to Medicine programme in Aberdeen other than Aberdeen and probably the Scottish Government, since it's their money? But if you want to present work in a framework that makes it of interest across the whole medical education community, you have to use theoretical frameworks. So just to summarise and then move on to the point about who has power. I think that if you were to look at medical education research, certainly 25 years ago, it was what I would call show and tell. So my current institution is LKC Medicine, but please don't think that this is what we do now. But at LKC Medicine, we did something, and this is what happened, and aren't we great? Or this idea of student satisfaction, or repeating somebody else's study. Now, you will see studies like this in journals, not the best journals, but in journals. It doesn't really move this type of research doesn't really move anything on. This is the kind of research that moves things on. Strong conceptual frameworks, studies that build on other studies, okay? And studies that can use theory to interpret things, that can just build on what's out there already, allow us to predict, explain, tease out all the kind of complexity of medical education, whatever the particular topic you're looking at. And certainly if you look at the journal Medical Education, Advances in Health Sciences Education, Perspectives in Medical Education, really these are the studies that you're seeing. So, I mean, that's kind of where one aspires to publish. There are other places, and I think that even when people are doing a lot of research, I do a fair bit, there are studies which you know are kind of that type of study that you want to get in the theoretically framed journals, the ones with international reach. And then there's other studies that you think, well, it's a small study, but it's kind of interesting, so I'll pop it somewhere else. It's all interesting, it's all useful, and it's all knowledge building. And where are we going now? It's about moving away from, I say opinion-based teaching. Obviously, this is more than teaching. This is about admissions, selection, assessment, curriculum. But let's just use teaching as shorthand. We used to just do opinion-based teaching. I like to think that now we're kind of a little further along the continuum of evidence-based teaching. We're not always there, and certainly on the ground, there's still a lot of opinion-driven medical education, even though there's a lot of research out there now. And I think one of my missions in life is using the evidence, not just creating the evidence, but using the evidence when it comes to the influence I have in my own medical school. But change is slow. God, change is slow. I'm not sure if it's just medical education or if it's education generally or if it's everything, but change is slow. And sometimes I do think we've not really moved on very far from those extracts from academic medicine I started with. But what I have observed in my years of being an old fart, still hanging around medical education after 25 years or whatever it is that there's politics. There's so much politics in our field. Student and medical schools will stick to what they do because, you know, they have their kind of students. They want to attract their kind of students, and that's good and that's fine. They don't want to change. but they don't exist in isolation. Nothing exists in isolation. And with the medical schools, if you just think of the context, think of the culture. There are so many things that influence what we do. And I'm not going to talk about all of these things, but this is about the world. There are things that we talk about now in medical education that we didn't talk about 10 years ago, and that's not because of medical education, that's because of the wider world. Black Lives Matter, Me Too, there's so many things that happen out there in the wider world, and those are influencing what happens within medical education. So just a very specific example of that before I finish. So, in 1997, the Deering report came out, and that was about widening access to higher education on economic grounds. So Deering was not a bleeding heart liberal. It wasn't about mobility. It wasn't about meritocracy. It was saying that the UK will be in a better position internationally if it has a more highly educated workforce. And that was in 1997. Now, yes, things changed. And then there was the Schwartz report in 2004, which talked about fair admissions to higher education. And yes, things changed. SPA was set up. But then I noticed, certainly in widening access and selection to medicine, there wasn't a lot happening, really. UK CAT came in, which was good. Things were changing, but gosh, it was slow. But the thing that made the biggest difference, the thing that actually kind of kicked things along, it was two reports by Alan Milburn and the independent the Social Mobility and Child Poverty Group. And those two documents, I think one was 2010 and one was 2012. And he said, you know, medicine has to try harder to widen access. It tries to try harder to change the nature of medical students. And because this was political and politically driven, suddenly the GMC went, oh my God, this is something that we have to do something about. And they commissioned some research, and that was, I led the team with John, who's here, Sandra, who's here, and others, and we did an enormous amount of work for very little money, I may add. Well, this was certainly a below minimum wage research grant, but it was a very good thing to do. It was a very good thing for my career, and it really opened up lots of doors for me personally. But more importantly, it really started to change things in terms of what was going on in this space in medical education. The GMC commissioned it. HEE then put a wodge of money into the cross-party selection for excellence group. There was lots of research commissioned. The MSc Selection Alliance was established, and that has gone from strength to strength. But that was politics. The problem had been there for a long time, but the politics kick-started some activities. And we can see it's still going on and growing, the expanded places, the new medical schools. So we need the evidence. We really need the evidence to do good medical education. But we have to be aware that there are other influences, and sometimes those influences can be useful. We can use them to move things along more quickly than would otherwise happen. So in conclusion, going back to what's true, what's evidence, and who has authority, well, I would say there's lots of different truths. There's the research truth, the research evidence. There's the truth, the truth that's held by medical schools of this is how we do things around here. I mean, we can't deny that that's a stance. And then there's the kind of political, social priorities. So truth can be considered in different ways. And because of that, so too can evidence be considered in different ways. You've got people's perceptions, you've got local data, you've got cumulative data, you've got knowledge building. But we can use it all. And then who has authority? Again, we've got people on the ground, we've got the local stakeholders, we've got the medical schools, we've got national groups, we've got politicians, we've got thought leaders. Again, lots of angles, lots of stances. And it's about trying to kind of pick a pathway through all of this that leads to change and leads to development in the field. As I said when I started, I wasn't going to give you any answers, but I hope maybe these are some things to think about. Nothing is straightforward, but having this idea that there is a big context and there are different influences, I think is quite liberating and certainly opens up lots of doors for medical education research. So hopefully I've kept time, I do try. And thank you, and hopefully there's some questions.
Thank you so much, Jen. I'm going to start roaming the floor, but perhaps while I do that, I was interested to ask you, who are your role models? Who excites you when you're reading the journals? Whose conceptual or theoretical work do you look to?
Well, that's nice. Well, I'm not being sycophantic, but I really love Salim's work. Where are you, Salim? Yep, because it's the same area as mine, but interesting frameworks, different ways of looking at things. Salim has skills and knowledge that I don't have, so I always really love seeing how he does things. I like Lorelei Lingard's work because I like the whole kind of team processes and that kind of the complexity of the workplace and teams and so on and so forth. There's probably others, but those would be the ones that jump out.
Thank you, Prof. That was a very thought-provoking talk. Thank you. You took an example of widening access for medical school. One of the things I've been pondering over is what happens after medical school. At least in the UK, we spend about 10 years in training, where there is an inbuilt education, what they call as postgraduate medical education. And to the best of my knowledge, there is neither a concept or a framework on which it's built on, and everybody has their own system. And to the best of my knowledge, I don't think there even exists a peer review system to see which works and which doesn't work. Unless I'm missing something, I was just wondering, are you aware of anything of this sort? And the second question is not related to this particular, but there's a lot of drive now, especially with medical schools charging quite a hefty money, saying what's the cost effectiveness and cost benefit of investing so much of money in medical education, both at the level of undergraduate and postgraduate learning. And I wanted to know, is there any kind of research that's going on towards cost benefit and cost effective analysis across diversity and aspects?
Oh, crumbs. There's about 6 questions there, actually. Let me try. No, it's okay. I'm going to try and answer one of them, and then if you don't mind, I'm going to hand over to somebody who knows about the postgrad world to answer your first question. So your second question, which was about you brought in diversity, but actually you started about cost and value in medical education. So that's actually a sphere of research that does seem to be emerging now. So my own team, we did a lot of work with health economists looking at, we did discrete choice experiments, so where we could actually put a cost, we could put a cash amount on the decisions that people made in terms of careers decision making particularly. But more widely, I think there's a movement, well, I know there's a movement because I'm part of the group looking at cost and value in medical education. And there's been a few AME guides in this, and there's now emerging research trying to look at, okay, and I'll use a kind of light-hearted example, but do we need to spend £1 million on a simulation machine, or could we just have people stitching up an orange? I know it's a silly example, but these are important questions to ask because we have got limited resources. And I do think that sticking to that example, and certainly in my current context, people do seem to think if it's new and shiny and high-tech, then it's better. Where's the evidence? Low-tech could be just as effective for learning. So I think because of our increasingly resource-constrained times, this is going to become a much more popular area of research. And as I say, there's a few people kind of filling that space. It's always good to kind of see the trends and make sure that you're in the ground. Could I ask, Alison, could I ask Peter to answer the first question, which was about models in postgraduate research? Is that okay, Peter? Yeah.
But perhaps it's easiest to come with the if so why, first of all, and that the curricula that we have are driven by principles which come from the NHS, rather than coming from purity of education, I would suggest. And so what we see is a pragmatic solution rather than an ideal one. Perhaps I'm being cynical in that regard, but my feeling is that we could do far better by allowing people more space in postgraduate training particularly to develop areas of interest that would be of value in the wider context rather than just simply down the path of service delivery. So that, I don't know, there's nods around the room, but I feel that what I'm saying is almost iconoclastic in a way, but that's fine. Is there a structure for postgraduate medical education? Well, no, not in curricula, but for exactly the same reason. Most curricula, if you look at them, will be approved. Well, all the curricula in the UK are approved by the General Medical Council, and there's a process through which that goes. So a curriculum is proposed by a college, is then scrutinised by a group called the Curriculum Oversight Group, which takes itself primarily from the NHS and the statutory education bodies. Thereafter, it's looked at by experts who include educationalists and medical specialists with advice from a variety of other sources which allow a curriculum to go forward. But the curriculum is based on the standards prescribed by the GMC. The content of that curriculum, again, it's somewhat arbitrary, but most of them will have an element of educational capacity within it. But the basis of it is around good medical practice. And whilst there are elements of good medical practice that include learning and teaching, if you look on the wider context at something like CanMeds, for example, the doctor is the scholar, the doctor is the educator, are much more apparent in those frameworks. So to some extent, we're constrained by the frameworks against which we pitch these curricula in the UK. It need not be so, and I'm hopeful that the GMC's revised good medical practice will have a bit wider a basis on which to build future curricula. So I don't know if that goes any way to answering your question, but that would be my understanding of where we are in relation to those topics just now.
Thanks, Peter. I told you he was going to be much better at that than I would be.
Thank you. I was really pleased and interested to hear you talk about the widening access work and how the tipping point in what you were doing and how it made an impact was actually through a politician. And so I think that's a really important point, and I think that people in the room here are interested in medical education research. And I was wondering what tips you might have for the audience in how to make their research more impactful by making that political change happen. Something I've been striving to do, but are there any golden nuggets that you could give everybody?
Well, I've actually got a whole other talk on that. I think a lot of it's about collaboration. So I would say that the most successful research I've done in my career was when we had a triumvirate of Peter, who you've just heard, Kim, who is somewhere here, and between us we covered medical schools, foundation programme and postgraduate training. And we knew what was important. So we kind of knew what was important to people on the ground, and we tried to make our research useful as well as theory-driven, and our research was published in the best journals because we did it well, but we answered questions that were important to the politicians and the governments. And that was self-fulfilling because we were delivering things that were useful. They gave us more money to do the next study. And it worked really, really well. So I could have been sitting in Aberdeen and doing little perfect studies that nobody cared about. But because we had this kind of really good team working together and bringing in things like health economists, linguists, sociologists, whatever, we were able to do work that was both impactful and knowledge building. And it did change things. So I think pick your collaborators very carefully and look at questions that are both, that are actually of use. Look to see if you can ask questions that will change things, that will get the ear of the politicians, or the ear, or the eye, whatever.
Hi, thank you for a very interesting talk. You mentioned about as the sort of age of a discipline increases, the areas of interest that are researched also changes. So about the different waves into you said about which research questions and what type of studies become more appropriate in the current sort of educational pedagogy and things that we know so far. What do you think would be the next wave that we then progress to, and what kinds of research do you think would maybe become important in the future?
Yeah. I think that we are looking, so, there are lots of different areas like assessment, selection, curricula, you name it. within each of these, we have to just keep moving things on and trying to understand what's going on, because only by understanding can we change things. And learning from others, I think, is important. Looking at around the world, while bearing in mind what I said earlier, that context is important, we can still learn from other people. So I think it's about diving even deeper into what's going on. The complexity, recognising the complexity, I say recognising complexity about 50 times in every discussion, because it's what we do is not straightforward, and there's a lot to unpick and trying to figure out what's going on. And using things like complexity theory, which there's a very good chapter in the book about, just that kind of looking at things through in ways that are appropriate for the question.
Can I follow up?
You can try, yes.
You mentioned about medical education research becoming increasingly like evidence-based teaching. And to me that sounds a lot similar like the way that research progressed in medicine, where it was increasingly, the opinions of eminent doctors, and then we had, our studies to back it up, and now we're in the realm of evidence-based medicine. I feel like there's been a strong push here about UK Med. Do you find that looking for evidence-based teaching is trying to make it increasingly quantitative in this previous, because the past medical education research, I'm very early stages, I don't know much about it, but it seems to have been a lot of qualitative stuff. Do you see that sort of changing in the future at all? Or?
It's actually swung. So there used to be loads of quantitative. If you looked at medical education in the 70s and 80s, it was all quantitative, and those of us who quite like qualitative felt neglected and uncared for. Whereas now I would say that it's kind of the pendulum has swung towards qualitative, but it'll swing back. There's trends, every area's got trends, but quantitative dominated until very, very recently. I think that the field needs both. I think things like UK Med studies are really, really important, having done some of them myself. But you also need the qualitative. The quantitative only tells you the facts, the outcomes, the predictive validity, all those kind of questions. But you need to also know the how. So we need both. We need a balance. And I think that some of the researchers at the moment, some of the big names internationally are quite qualitative, but that doesn't mean to say that the people of tomorrow who are the big names won't be quantitative. But if you look at things like there's a whole lot of research in cognitive neuroscience, and that's very quantitative, and that's kind of getting bigger. So, and it's there out, the educational neuroscience is out there in other journals, but maybe just not as visible to us, but there's a lot going on that's quantitative. So, yeah, horses for courses, we need both.
Thank you.
Salim has asked to have last words, so I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you so much for this excellent talk. Just in terms of, when I was hearing about the UK Med, and I didn't know much about it because I'm not from here, I thought it was a wonderful, great idea to put together all this big data and so on. But then I got worried about the ethics of it and the use of the data and so on. And I just wonder if you've, because it could be used in punitive ways and all kinds of things, if it's not used right. I just wonder if you have thought about that in the work that you do in terms of the actual use of your research and how it will, be understood by people who have power over people's lives. Like in widening access and so on. Sure.
I mean, I think, I won't go into the detail, but I think UK Med is extremely highly regulated, and I mean, Daniel would be able to tell us it's very highly, the research that's carried out with UK Med is very highly scrutinised. So I actually have and this system was set up with a lot of legal advice. So I have a great deal of confidence in not just the database, but also the system. So, and I won't go into detail because there are people better placed than I.
Just by pointing it out, I didn't mean to say it that way. I just wanted to, like, data governance is really important.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting because when we talk about UK made across the world, one of the I mean, certainly in Singapore, one of the other medical schools went, oh, let's do a Singapore med, and they went, oh, well, we'll just like take everyone's data and we'll do some studies, and I was like, it's not happening. And I was like, go and talk to this man. And here's a paper that John Dill and Daniel and a bunch of us did many years ago. I think there's just a complete lack of understanding of the complexity of setting these things up so that individuals were protected. But I think that your question's broader than UK Med. Your question is about using research so not to cause harm. So it's just as in medicine, do not cause harm. Oh, I think we put a lot of faith into our reviewers and our editors and the senior people in the field to make sure that that doesn't happen. But it has, and I think now things are much more open. There are many, many more discussions about who has the power in editing and publishing and who has the power within the field, and those are kind of in their infancy, but they've started and they will progress and things hopefully will change. But yeah, there are power imbalances at the moment.
Awesome. Okay, so thank you very much to Jen and to those who've posed questions.